There was a post in a group that I'm in online not too long ago that somebody had posted that it was rather simplistic in its message, but it actually got me to thinking about something. And it was the person who posted it said that at one point during the time they were going to AA meetings, they had made up their mind that they would just never drink again, so that they would never have to worry about steps or meetings or anything else, and that it had never occurred to him that they could have just got up and walked out of a meeting and never came back at any given time. And of course, I did the same thing. I was in AA for over a decade. Now, we're not counting the times that I was court ordered into AA and forced into AA for that 18 months. But at any given time, even with the pressure that was going on from the toxic family members that I've talked about, or from the landlord I was living with that was in AA that I was talking about on here before, I could have done the very same thing. I could have just walked out and never came back. And yet I used to sit there, even especially during my relapse periods, and I would look at the clock and I couldn't wait for the meeting to end so I could head to the nearest liquor store. Or I would look at the clock and I would think to myself, I've still got 20 more minutes to listen to this shit. Never seeming to occur to me the whole entire time that I could have just got up and walked out of those meetings and never dealt with any of that ever again. It's something that is literally a typical case of hindsight being 2020 when I look back on it now, and sometimes am mystified by the fact that I spent so long and so much time in the fellowship and in those rooms. But I pondered on that a little bit, and it occurred to me that one of the most dangerous things about AA overall is not the idiotic meetings. It's not the book full of all the ridiculous assertions and logical fallacies. It's not even the toxic people, the malignant people that populate those meetings. It's the illusion that because it's a meeting and because it's some kind of time and tried and true method, that it's ingrained in popular culture, that it must have some kind of authority as to what it's talking about. And I don't know, there was, like I said, it was just something I pondered on a little bit when I got to thinking about that. There was actually, it brought to mind another example of treatment center counselors that I ran across during my time going in and out of treatment centers. I've been to 4 of them all total. And these people had no real qualifications on what to do with my life. They had no qualifications or any deep insights into the nature of addiction. And they didn't have anything more, it seemed to be, than just carbon copies of what I would see in AA, the AA clones. They knew how to repeat the slogans. They knew how to talk the lingo. They knew how to say all the right things, wrong things, actually, when you really think about it. But they didn't have any deep insights into anything, and yet there was some part of me that felt almost like that there's some part of me that almost felt like because they had the title of addiction counselor, or because they had some letters after their name denoting some kind of degree in social work or whatever it is they would get, that they must have some kind of authority as to what they were telling people, or that the things they were doing to us in treatment, which was, excuse me, sinuses, springtime, and allergies where I'm located, but some of the cruel practices they were doing to people in treatment, that they must have some reasonable idea as to why they're doing these things, otherwise they wouldn't be, simply because they had a position of authority, they had a title, or they had some kind of credentials that lent them some reason for me to put some kind of imaginary trust in them. There was no reason to do that whatsoever, any more than there was any reason for me to give any credence to so-called AA sponsors or big book thumpers or any of the rest of them. I mean, one of the things that used to get me so upset when I would sit in those meetings and hear that absolute bullshit was, one thing was because it was blatantly false and it was blatantly idiotic what they were talking about, but another part of me was upset because I knew that there were people like me in there that were trying to get over their drinking problems and were being fed misinformation. But another part of that was because these people were given some kind of special rank, some kind of special, it was almost like people treated them like they had some inherent right within them, some divine authority to speak as though they knew what they were talking about or they were qualified to tell people what they were supposed to be doing with their lives. One of the things that, I think anybody who's been around the fellowship, if you want to call it a fellowship, I think that's a poor choice of words for the religious cult that it really is. But if you've been around it for any length of time and you get to know those people, you get to see that they're generally very abhorrent type of people in their everyday lives, that they do very dirty and low down things, even in their positions that some of them get into, like treatment center counselors or social workers or whatever the titles is they give out for these people that run these halfway houses and other kinds of things. They're sadistic type of people that are, drunk on their own power most of the time, but they have no more of a qualification to tell you what to do with your life or any more insight into your life than anybody else than the average person on the street. It reminds me of an old George Carlin quote one time where he said, "I have as much authority as the Pope does. I just don't have as many people who think so." Kind of meaning the illusion of authority is what actually gives these people any kind of credence whatsoever. The idea that AA itself, because it's a fellowship, because it's been around a long time, because it's seeped its way into the pop culture segment of our society, somehow gives it some kind of credence of authority. In fact, the most dangerous illusions I found out just in my own observations of life in general are the illusions that are popular illusions. The AA people have saved millions of people, they'll tell you. The fellowship has saved millions of people. People recite that without even thinking deeply about what they're saying. They just recite it because they've been told to say it, and because they've been told to say it so many times, it has become some kind of truth to them. I even used to say it when I was a good little cult member in the AA fellowship. I'd say, well, this thing has saved millions of people. I didn't have any evidence for that. I didn't have anything for that other than the numerous people in the fellowship who had already told me that. In fact, the illusion of authority was something, I've touched upon it here before with the Stanford experiment, with the prison experiment that went haywire, or I think pretty much everybody out there knows about the Milgram experiment, where it was done in the 60s. I've seen video footage of it, by the way, where these people were told that they were going to shock these test subjects in regards to some kind of experiment to see how memorization worked. And of course, the electric shocks were supposed to get more severe the more times the so-called patient got the answers wrong. And of course, those patients weren't really patients, they were actors. The real test subjects of this experiment were the people that were hitting the shock button. And of course, even Milgram himself, who developed the experiment, was really shocked by how high the results was of the number of people who was pushing these buttons that were supposedly administering electric shocks to these test subjects to the point that it could kill them. In fact, some of the video footage I saw on YouTube not too long ago, there were even people that were arguing with the authoritative figures behind them, the so-called scientists or whatever it was they were posing as, and saying, well, if I give him another if I give him another electric shock, it could possibly kill him. And the person would say, well, continue on with the experiment anyway, and they would continue on with the experiment. Now, of course, when it was revealed that the people who were receiving these electric shocks were actors, and that the people who were administering these were actually the test subjects, a lot of them got very highly defensive about the whole entire thing. Well, I wasn't actually trying to kill anybody. You told me to do it, was kind of the standard line from some of the people who went along with it. The curious thing about that, a lot of people, are aware of that experiment, and they generally look at it as, well, people will do inherently bad things, and they kind of use it to justify the idea that people are inherently bad, and therefore we need some kind of authoritative figure to keep us all in line. But to me, one thing that was very telling about that I never really latched onto strongly before when I've talked about it in videos, is this: the people who were doing that thought they were shocking these people to the point that they would die, they weren't doing that under the promise of a reward. Hey, pull the electric plug on these people until you give them 1,000,000 volts and they, die, and we'll give you $1,000,000. They weren't doing it because they were told, if you don't give these people 1,000,000 electric volts and, give them the equivalent of the electric chair in administrating these voltage shocks, your family will be tortured. They didn't tell them that their life was on the line. They didn't do it under a threat of pain. They didn't do it under a promise of a reward. You know, do this and we'll give you a whole lot of money or something like that. They did it simply because they were told to do this. And to me, it shows how easily, when you are presented with an authoritative figure in your life, how easily it is, and somehow how inborn it almost is. I could speculate on that, and if I did that, it would turn into a long lecture, and we'd be here for the next 3 or 4 hours. So I'll just keep it short. That when faced with something that appears to have an illusion of authority, it's not really authority whatsoever. Like the people that were given those electric shocks, the person standing behind them telling them to continue those tests had no power over them whatsoever. Okay, they didn't have a gun to their head. They didn't have a locked door saying you can't leave here until you administer those shocks, or we'll leave you in here to starve you to death or something like that. They didn't have a bunch of armed goons standing behind them, you know, with a whole lot of truncheons and batons and stuff saying, if you don't continue the test, we're going to beat you until you do. They didn't have any of that. They were faced with a figure that looked to them like a figure in authority, telling them what to do. In other words, if you had a group of random strangers, let's say you're sitting at a bus stop, or let's say you're sitting on a park bench somewhere, and a group of strangers came up to you and they said, your problem is selfishness and self-centeredness driven by 100 forms of fear, and unless you tell us all your dirty little secrets for the rest of your life, you're doomed to die a horrifying death. You would probably look at those people and you would say, get the fuck away from me. You people are fucking nuts. Who the fuck do you think you are to come up to me and start telling me this kind of shit? That's what any normal human being would do under those conditions. But yet, when you're put into the atmosphere of a group with a so-called sacred text and with an authoritative bent to it, a group that has support from pop culture and even from the government itself, there's an inclination to kind of go along with it, to kind of obey even with it. The Milgram experiment, for example, a lot of those people who were administering those electric shocks to the point they thought they were killing those people, these weren't malicious sadists, okay? These weren't people that were like concentration camp guards or something. You know, I love doing this. I hope I get to kill more people after I kill this guy. That wasn't the overall image that I got from watching these people. These seemed like quite ordinary people that were even looking at the authoritative figure behind them and saying, look, if I keep this up, this guy's going to die. I mean, are you sure you want me to do this? And, you know, their own conscience was grappling with them at that point, but because they were faced with this authority figure, they just capitulated to it. I remember, and I looked before I started this video and I couldn't find it. I remember watching a thing. It was a long time ago. A real long time ago, but it was one of these test situations where they had a bunch of lines in the floor that were painted, and they would get like 5 or 6 people to point to the shortest line in the floor, and these were all, of course, actors, with the test subject being unaware that they were a test subject, but they would point to the shortest line in the floor, and they would say, obviously, this is the longest line in the floor. Now, of course, in a situation like that, most people, you know, I'm not so sure they truly believed that. They would just say, yeah, you guys are right. It obviously is. They probably were doing that more than likely to avoid confrontation or to avoid an argument. The same way a lot of people like myself don't get into certain discussions online because you just don't feel like arguing with a million people all at once. Even though when it comes to AA, I don't have any problem doing that because I know what I'm talking about when it comes to AA. But in a situation like that, it's relatively harmless to see how group pressure can make an individual say things that they know are not true or conform to things that they know are not necessarily true. It becomes inherently more dangerous when you put it into a group setting where people's lives are on the line, where an addiction is destroying their life, could possibly end up in their death, could possibly end up in being institutionalized or put in prison or whatever. And you're feeding them all this misinformation, and you don't see anybody who probably knows it's bullshit sitting next to you, who probably knows that this is not true. You see nobody speaking out about it. Not because I think when it comes to AA, because of any, to avoid a conflict or anything like that, but because they're literally terrified that they won't be accepted by the group. The group has become a form of ubiquitous authority to them, an authority that it's never occurred to them that they could always question. I mean, the most that could happen to you if you spoke up in an AA meeting and said this is all a bunch of bullshit or whatever it is, the most that could happen is some old timers would say some nasty things in their shares right after you. Okay, that's not going to kill you. It's not going to hurt you. It's not even going to really do anything to you. You might be like I was, where you're in the social alienation spectrum, and everybody pretends you're not really there, and you walk into a room and everybody turns their back on you and has these busy conversations right in front of you, making it very obvious that you don't belong or anything like that. But overall, the actual punishment from not belonging to a group is very mild when you think about it. I mean, the AA group can't actually take you out and have you executed. They can't throw you into a prison somewhere and have you mistreated. They can if you're there via the court system and you're being coerced, as I know from a year in drug court. But in of itself, when you're free to come and go to AA as you choose, the only real power the actual group has is the importance that you give that group of having power over you. Once that illusion, they're always talking about the illusion we're like other people has to be smashed. What they're really saying is they want you to believe you cannot be like other people, that the group is the only place that you can truly ever be accepted and understood. Further, another way to make you a cult member. But when that notion that a group has authority or a group has any kind of bearing on your life whatsoever, when you can destroy that, then I think a large portion of what drives you in AA loses its grip on you. It was one of the things that helped me on some subconscious level leave AA, even though I wasn't aware of it at the time. It wasn't like I said to myself, well, the group that never had any control over me to begin with, that I sort of handed my willpower over to the group because they told me to do that, and because their horseshit book told me to do that, and because my addiction was killing me. And so out of desperation, I did that. It wasn't like I realized that on any, aware level right at the forefront of my brain. It was like, subconsciously. I mean, I think a lot of people leave AA because they see through the phoniness of the whole entire thing. They see the hypocrisy of these members who are drunk on their own power and using those powers to abuse people. They leave because they see how idiotic the literature is, that it makes a bunch of baseless assertions that are not even remotely connected to reality whatsoever. And I think maybe later on down the line, when you break free of it, you can kind of realize that on some level. But I think that was one of the things that kept pulling me back to it. There was almost like there's some part of me that I didn't even want to admit was convinced that there was something there in those rooms that was saving me from destructive drinking. And there was absolutely nothing saving me from destructive drinking except my own self. It sounds really cliche, what I'm about to say, but it's actually very true, or at least it is in my case, is that, the old film, The Wizard of Oz, right? You got the scarecrow looking for his brains, you got the tin guy looking for his heart, you got the lion looking for his courage, you got, all of that, and yet the ultimate lesson of that overall film, or at least the literature, not the film itself, it was based on a series of books, and there are some Oz books, if you've ever looked at them, or if you've ever seen the 1985 continuation with a very young Fairuza Balk, you'd know what I'm talking about, that get really, really out there. But the overall moral of that particular tale, as it was told throughout that film, is the thing that they were all looking for, they already had. They already had brains, they already had heart, they already had courage. And, I think that was, like I said, it sounds like some cliche thing that you would put on the back of a freaking Hallmark card or something like that. But I think it was very important for me to realize that the only thing that was saving me from any destructive behaviors in my life when it come to, drinking myself to death or doing anything else that was, primarily drinking myself to death, that was my main destructive force. That the key to actually doing anything about that didn't rest with some sponsor. It didn't rest with some fellowship. It didn't rest with some bullshit book that was written back in the 1930s that had no connection whatsoever to any actual psychology or medicine. But the answer to it all lied within me the whole entire time. And then, that's actually just realizing that you do have control. You're not powerless and you don't need them. You know, when it comes to sponsors, for example, I mean, I let sponsors talk me into some of the most ridiculous ideas or into some of the stupidest suggestions that I could possibly ever imagine. And part of the reason I'm creating this video that got me to thinking about it was, if any normal, ordinary stranger at work, let's just say, or somebody on the street or somebody living next door to me had come up to me and started telling me, you're only as sick as your secrets. You need to write down what you're afraid of, because fear is like stealing. Or if somebody had come up to me and said something like, you're not capable of love because you're selfish and self-centered. This book right here tells you that. You wouldn't give those people any kind of credence whatsoever. You'd tell them to fuck off. You'd say, who the fuck do you think you are to show up here and start telling me this kind of crap? Go fuck off. But because the AA authority illusion thing gives you this idea that sponsors have some kind of clue as to how life works. There was reasons I would listen to those people when I had no real rational reason to do so whatsoever. It used to kill me in meetings how people would share about something their sponsor told them that was just life-changing. You know, anybody out there remember that old 1970s series Kung Fu? You know, where anytime he was in a situation, he'd have a moment of recognition in his past with his masters that gave him some great lesson or some great pearl of wisdom that called for the situation at hand. AA is not like that at all. These people have no special training. These people have no credentials. A lot of these people, in fact, the majority of the sponsors that I knew, were people that had completely fucked up lives that got some kind of high out of telling other people what to do. It would be no different than somebody with no existence whatsoever, with nothing to validate their life whatsoever, deciding, well, you know what I'll do? I'll just go around and tell other people what to do with their lives because it makes me feel powerful when I do that. It makes me feel strong when I do that. It keeps me from looking at what a fucking loser I really am. And that's really all those sponsors boil down to. So anyway, that was what I thought about when I started recording this one. I know I'm always talking about making more. I know I'm always talking about not waiting a month before I do them, but I mean, things happen and things get busy here. But I will try to get another one up sooner than a month later. Until then.